This is a re-recording of the introduction, so I'll begin by sharing my screen, and from there we can add this to what was an original presentation. So just to get the screen up, there we go. Yeah. So let me begin by saying it's a co-authored presentation, and my co-author is Srimayi Tenali, who's a master's student, a master's sustainability student here at the University of Sydney, and I'm Phil McManus, who's a professor in environmental and urban geography here at the University of Sydney. So our presentation today is Climate Change Acknowledgement to Promote Sustainable Development. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded country on which the original seminar took place, which was at the University of Sydney, being the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded country on which the online participants were based, and to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the country in which they're on. But also, as I said today, this presentation is a re-recording, and I'm currently coming to you from Wongal country in the inner west of Sydney, and pay respects to the elders of unceded country, past, present and emerging. So what I'm presenting today, for the first part here with Srimayi and myself, is about a journal article. You can see the full title there is in the journal Sustainable Development, which has been a long-term journal as part of the Wiley group of journals. And it was received by the journal on 21st of September 2021. It was revised again and submitted 4th of February, and was accepted soon afterwards on the 17th of February, and is now available for publication for people to read. So to go back to the story, how did we get to submit a journal article in 21st of September 2021? The story came about when Srimayi, who was a student in the first year Introduction to Sustainability unit of study that runs as part of the Master of Sustainability program, approached me to say, would I be interested in doing effectively the equivalent of a summer supervision with her on some piece of work? And I said yes. The story at the time was that she was on a Fulbright scholarship but couldn't get to Australia because it was COVID-19. I'd recently broken my leg and was at home, and we had a whole thing about being online and no in-person classes anyway. So, and I knew Srimayi was a very good student, and I thought this would be interesting. Let's see how we go with it. And we started off just working out what would be a particular topic that we could do, what was important, what would build upon previous knowledge that she had, what was important to Srimayi, essentially. And as we started working on this idea of climate change acknowledgement in coastal Florida, we realised that there was a lot in it. There was a lot that needed to be said, and Srimayi and I worked well, and she's obviously very, very good researcher. And we decided then that, okay, we've got something to say. Perhaps we'll extend this idea of a summer scholarship of, no, not scholarship, a summer study of about 5 to 6 weeks into something more substantial that did actually go through the second semester, part of the second semester of 2021. So we then decided to write an article, and the whole process of mentoring to select a journal, to write an article to the requirements of the journal, to submit it, to get feedback, revise and resubmit again, and that was part of the learning process. So what you have here is a presentation today based upon that process. So I'm doing the introduction at the moment, and then we'll move on to talk about the methods and the findings, and Srimayi will take over part of that and do the analysis and the conclusions and the next steps. So what I'm showing now is an image that highlights the importance of this particular issue in places such as Florida, coastal Florida. This is an image that came from The Guardian. It's one that we found afterwards rather than prior to doing the study, but I think it encapsulates a lot of the issues that we're talking about in terms of coastal flooding in a large American city. And it's a sort of issue that you can imagine being pertinent for Australian cities and for other places in the world in parts of East Asia. So the paper that we're talking about that we did was not so much based upon the large cities, because they do get attention. They are suitable for perhaps media images, and there's more salience, and they tend to attract these sort of graphics of potential future scenarios. But we're looking at small towns in Florida, and particularly there's a lot of small towns in Florida, as we'll explain as we go through the research methods.
So yeah, so back to South Florida, around Miami area, and this is an unusual image compared to the stereotype image of palm trees and an island and small island state or a large ocean country. But yeah, it's a place that you could imagine somewhere like the Gold Coast or other parts of Australia. But in places like Miami, there definitely is rising water, seawater coming up, especially through the tides and through the drainage system in the city. So it strikes a chord. Oops, we're not moving anywhere now. Okay, so and asked from this some questions about what is the role of climate change and acknowledgement, thinking about to actually recognise that what we just saw there potentially is a result of climate change, not some other factors, which in the Australian context you could say drought and flooding rains, but in America maybe extreme weather events or something else. And what key discursive practices underpin acknowledgement in local government sustainability plans? And we're particularly interested in Florida, but then what are the broader implications of this for other places beyond Florida? So in order to do that, we talked through how would we do a study in the time period that was available, what approach would we take, and how is it going to be useful. So what we've adopted is critical discourse analysis, which is an approach invented or devised by Norman Fairclough, who's at the University of Lancaster. And this particular format of the text, the discourse practice, and the socio-cultural practice, that yellow, dark blue, and light blue rectangle will appear in some of the slides that Srimayi is showing. So you would be able to place yourself in terms of what aspect of whether she's talking about the text or discourse practice or the socio-cultural practice. But to try and summarise this for people who may not be familiar with it, I thought, how am I going to try and explain this? And the easiest way I thought, as it turned out, was Eurovision contest on the weekend. I accidentally watched the last 10 minutes of it. That's something else. So I'm sure you watched hours of it, didn't you? But the last 10 minutes, I learned a few things. One, how to drag a lecture forever, because 10 minutes is a long time. 10 minutes. I mean, the judges were just amazing. So watch out, second-year students, because it was just like the content of 2 minutes was really dragged out. But that's not what I want to talk about. Essentially, the idea here is that the text is, no need for a spoiler alert, Ukraine won Eurovision, and a lot of people were very happy. But you wouldn't necessarily understand if you only looked at the text that Ukraine won Eurovision as to actually why did they win it. So if we look at the discourse practice, you need to know something about the voting methods in Eurovision. Now, Eurovision is obviously a nationalistic sort of contest in that countries compete against each other, somewhat similar to the Olympic Games, for example, but we don't get to vote in the Olympic Games on who did the best shot put or whose triple jump was the best standard. It's not as if it's audience participation, whereas with Eurovision, there are two parts to it. There's one is the judges who vote, and the other is the public who vote as well. And clearly Ukraine won it because they got most of the public votes. They got a huge proportion of public votes. In order to understand why Ukraine got most of the public votes, you need to look further at the socio-cultural practice. Here we're looking at the invasion by Russia, another country which was not eligible then to be part of Eurovision. In terms of February the 24th, one country invaded another. It upset all the stuff about national sovereignty, etc., but also brought up a whole lot of feelings about World War II, about totalitarian states, etc., and human rights abuses. So there are a whole lot of reasons why Ukraine got a sympathy vote from various people, and that's the socio-cultural practice that we're talking about, that you need to understand that in order to make sense of the discourse practice and then to understand the text that emerged. And similar things would happen if you look at an example of climate change acknowledgement in South Florida or coastal Florida. So we then use this particular approach, and there's many ways of doing various aspects of discourse analysis. We did a review of some of the more recent ones and worked out how to do it in terms of our own particular study here. The next step was to try and, in a time period, work out what we're actually going to study, what particular documents, etc., we're going to study, and how would that be represented in some way. So we focused on small towns, incorporated places. So in the United States, there are a lot of unincorporated places as well, where often richer people spend time outside not having to pay land taxes and things to local governments. But incorporated places, and Florida is particularly, I guess, known for having a lot of smaller places. So we looked at those on the Atlantic coast, because there's also the Gulf of Mexico, so that rules out variables by only looking at the one coast. And we looked at the small to medium size, so that was determined as a population range of between 5 and 50,000 people, which led us to 47 classified towns of the 383 that we started with. Then we decided, in terms of documentation, sustainability action plans, or SAPs, as you can see in the bottom, we need to look at recent SAPs. So rather than looking at old documentation or places that didn't have any, we looked at those that were in the last, what was called the last 3 years, so 2018 to then 2021. So by that stage, we had 12 eligible SAPs we could look at. And from that, we chose 5 case study locations. And those 5 case study locations here are shown on the map, but also in small blue circles, you can see some of the other places that we didn't choose. So we were careful here to select places in North, Central, and South Florida. And Srimayi, in a few minutes, will talk about those different places and take you through the characteristics of each and what it meant in terms of the way they did their sustainability action plans. But in terms of the case study selection, this matrix here is a simplified profile, I guess, of the various places. What was the document title for each of the 5 places? You can see the range of population. They're all small, but there is a bit of a range within it, geographically from north through to the south, but also the year in which their documents were published. So that's a sort of an overview of the 5 case studies that we had. And I'll hand over to Srimayi now, because she'll take us through the different document title, the authors, and through to the analysis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And with that, I would love to take you through, as Phil said, the actual action plans that we studied and what we found from each of them. So at a high level, you can see the main findings here in front of you. And what I want to draw your attention to is that of the 5 towns we looked at, the climate action approach varies pretty widely. So 3 out of the 5 towns have this joint adaptation and mitigation approach, where they really think about long-term sustainability. But 2 out of the 5 have more of this adaptation focus, where they're just thinking about immediate coastal impacts. What's interesting is that that doesn't tie in directly with the county's political leaning, as you might expect it to. One note there is that in the US and in Florida specifically, voters register with their county and not with a particular town. So it is possible that these towns do not necessarily follow the same trends as the county that they are represented in. But it is interesting to note that in Florida, that doesn't seem to be the biggest factor that influences how these towns think about sustainability. What does seem to matter, though, is the recent storm flooding, as well as the anthropogenic climate change acknowledgement, which, as Phil alluded to, is sort of the main idea of our paper. In those towns where you see high acknowledgement of the anthropogenic roots of climate change, there was that balanced approach to climate action. And we'll see those same themes sort of repeated as we look at each of the towns individually. So to start us off, just going from north to south, we looked at Neptune Beach, which is a very small town in northern Florida, pretty close to Jacksonville. And Neptune Beach's plan was titled A Sustainable and Resilient City. And after that initial use of the word sustainable, sustainability pretty much doesn't show up again in its plan. So this plan really addresses climate change in a consequential fashion and really only looks at it as a threat. So it describes this town as under severe threat. There's a lot of language about guarding vulnerable openings, protecting and preparing the town against devastation. And there's really no action or context as to why these things are happening to the town or how the town could potentially alleviate or mitigate anything. And then there's this initial sentence here about the intercoastal waterway and how that's very important to the town. But after that, there's really no environmental impacts or ecosystems centered anywhere in the document. And instead, economic justifications are used for any of the strategies proposed. So what that does is it sort of just creates this tense and almost anxious document where they're clearly under threat, under attack, and they just need to rally as much as possible to prevent monetary loss and property damage. If we zoom out a little and we look at the discourse practice in which Neptune Beach developed this plan. So this document was developed as part of their larger 2020 vision plan. And that was created in collaboration with a lot of stakeholders. So they brought together residents, the city council, business owners. It was because of COVID, all held online. And that helped to really create like a huge number of people, hundreds of people showing up for these town halls, virtual workshops, and surveys. What's interesting is that of all the citizens and the surveys conducted, the emphasis on sustainability was very low. So not a lot of people voted for anything to do with sustainability. And a lot of people did vote for issues such as construction and traffic and maybe things that pertain more closely to their daily life. And that's really reflected in the plan, which really just takes the priorities of the citizens and talks about those. Second, Neptune Beach was also just devastated by some recent hurricanes. So in 2016, Hurricane Matthew, and in 2017, Hurricane Irma, both caused extensive damage and flooding in the town of Neptune Beach. And that too seems to have weighed on the city's mind as it listed its priorities. Flooding and coastal adaptation were just very high in the document. Climate change was not. If we move to the next city of Cocoa, there really could not be a more opposite example because Cocoa is so forward-thinking and progressive when it comes to sustainability. Cocoa is a town in Brevard County, so we've now moved to Central Florida, and it's located within a Republican county, but Cocoa is probably one of those political outliers that I sort of mentioned earlier. It has a very highly diverse demographic compared to the rest of the county. And in terms of socioeconomic standing, it's a little bit lower than average. So it does seem to lean a little bit differently than the county overall. And Cocoa takes this really positive approach to sustainability. It defines sustainability in great technical detail. It opens with the Brundtland definition, then it goes on to talk about all different models of sustainability, how they might apply to the city. And it acknowledges the anthropogenic roots of climate change very clearly and distinctly. What that does is it sort of empowers Cocoa as a change maker rather than just like passively receiving threats. And it just creates this action-oriented, optimistic tone overall. The discourse practice of Cocoa is also a little bit different. This too had a high degree of community involvement, but it was more specifically a sustainability advisory committee was developed, and there was one specific environmental leader, one of the councilwomen in the town council, who formed that committee and really spearheaded this effort from start to finish. It was estimated that overall this plan took over 800 hours of volunteer work, but this group of volunteers was very dedicated. They had working groups. They went through and systematically looked at the town across a range of initiatives. They met with experts, and it all led to this document, which is just highly specific and plan focused overall. The other thing to note is that Cocoa has not really had to deal with flooding issues in recent years. So they have had some hurricane issues, as with other towns, but the issues were more to do with power outages and a lot less to do with coastal issues of flooding. So that might have also influenced the content of this plan. Stewart, which is another town in Central Florida, follows with a very similar positive approach to sustainability. So Stewart is a fishing and boating hub, and the environment is one of the biggest factors in city decision-making because of that. You can see sort of from this image as well, but the cover of their plan splits sustainability for the city into 7 different categories, and then it just really methodically goes through each of the subtopics. And what's really unique about Stewart is that it actually aligns itself with the Paris Agreement and the IPCC. So it's referencing scientific reports. It's really building this genre of credibility and accountability. And it by aligning itself with this international consensus and broader consensus, it just has this spirit of we can really make a difference. And here's how we are part of this much larger picture. The other thing to know about Stewart is that they've actually not had hurricane issues at all in the recent years. So 2005 was the last major hurricane in Stewart. And in terms of the practice, community practice around Stewart, this plan was also led by a sustainability committee, but the committee was not volunteer-based. So this sustainability committee was composed of city staff across multiple departments. And then the mayor himself mentioned that one of the key drivers of moving this plan forward was a youth climate strike that had been held back in 2019, gained a lot of media attention, and really put pressure on the city council to move issues of sustainability forward. And so in 2020, as a direct response to the strike, the city actually declared it the year of climate action for Stewart, and then later on released this document. So Stewart also just really acknowledges anthropogenic climate change, takes this balanced approach, and has a range of strategies across different departments and industries. Now moving into South Florida, we look at Hallandale Beach, which is a larger town. So it's on the other end of the size-wise town spectrum. And this one's really an interesting case because Hallandale Beach never defines sustainability, and it never acknowledges that climate change is anthropogenically caused. But if you look at the content of the plan, it's really, really rigorous. The strategies are so specific in terms of transitioning to clean energy, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Like they've really done the content without the explicit acknowledgement. So that is definitely a conscious choice. And many times in the document, you see phrases about gaining stakeholder approval and garnering widespread approval. So that was definitely a conscious choice not to ruffle any feathers. But what the one consequence of that is that this document doesn't have that same urgent, passionate tone that you sort of saw from Stewart and Coco, for example. It's a little bit more objective, and it does fall back on economic justifications when it's finally talking about the strategies at hand. Hallandale Beach, this plan was developed by external consultants, not the city council itself, which probably contributed to its rigorousness in terms of development. No specific leaders really emerged in our study of the documents around this, but it does seem like there's a general culture of sustainability at Hallandale Beach. So this town is actually really susceptible to king tides. And recently king tides had contaminated 5 of their 8 freshwater wells. So the issues of sustainability are just really on the city's mind, and it doesn't seem to be some crazy concept. It is interesting though, that it's not necessarily had that same explicit acknowledgement that you would expect from such a rigorous document. And then lastly, we looked at Cutler Bay, which is south of Miami in South Florida. So Cutler Bay is like a very residential town, and its plan is actually doesn't even have the word sustainable in the title. It's called a green master plan. And green really is the main terminology that Cutler Bay uses. So they don't define what it means to be green, but that is the goal. And it's really used synonymously with sustainability throughout. They also very explicitly share that the purpose of this document is to achieve the gold certification in the Florida Green Building Coalition certification process. The town is currently at silver. So because of that, this document is less of a plan and more of a list of all of the activities that the town is doing that have been sort of green. There's no real prioritization across activities. So one dot point will be give all employees keep cups. And then the second dot point will be transition away from dirty fuels. So it really lacks a sense of urgency or prioritization or vision, and is more like a master list, which to be fair, it is the green master plan. But they do lack that overarching goal, and they don't acknowledge climate change at all. So of the 80 initiatives they propose in this document, only 1 references climate change, and it specifically considers coastal adaptation only. There's just no mention of anthropogenic climate change, and therefore this document is a bit scattered and really lacks the vision that these other cities have managed to grasp. So the tone is really the major difference across these documents, and Cutler Beach, Cutler Bay, Neptune Beach, and to an extent Hallandale Beach are just very passive in their documentation. You can see from these quotes, they don't acknowledge climate change, and instead they're focusing more on risk management, on the city's short-term economic goals, on maybe the reputation or brand of the city. And what that does is take away prioritization from just long-term community objectives. You can see like a really remarkable difference if you compare these to these. So now if we look at Coco and Stewart instead, we can see that overall they have this strong faith in local capacity. They really believe in themselves as an ability to make a difference. And they take this active, optimistic tone, not just viewing climate change as this blanket threat, but rather as this challenging opportunity, appealing to proactive responses. And this makes a clear difference in terms of what the plan comes out to be at the end. The last layer of our analysis was the sociocultural practice, as Phil mentioned. So there's two main things we wanted to chat about in terms of what it is like in sustainability in Florida. So first of all, the coast is very, very, very important to Florida. It relies so heavily on its coast for employment, for tourism, for infrastructure. And a recent study at the University of Florida found that first order impacts from just modest sea level rise could cause over $75 billion of damage to Florida. That's not even counting second order impacts like unemployment or tax revenue losses. So the coast is economically very important. If we look one step further, residents and tourists and almost anyone will vote very highly in any survey you can find that the ocean and the beach is essential to their Florida experience. And so there's this cultural aspect as well. So for Floridians, the ocean and beach is just culturally very relevant. It has an intrinsic value that's not even captured by that 75 billion number. What's hard about Florida is that economic justifications are often used to make claims. And we saw that in the plans as well, where looking at property damage or looking at monetary loss is sort of an easy way to justify changes. But it really falls short of capturing that true value of what the coast is like to Florida. And what's also dangerous is on one side, economic justifications can really have a common ground and bring people together to take action regardless of political affiliation. But on the other hand, it's a bit of a slippery slope because social objectives and community objectives that don't have that dollar value on them can easily fall to the wayside in such a process. Second, we have to also talk about the political swing at the Florida state level. So at the state level, Florida's actually been under Republican governance for over the past 2 decades. But there's actually been oscillating periods of climate support and climate denial. So if we go back to 2009 under Governor Charlie Crist, who was Republican, Florida was actually quite ahead of its time for climate action. And Charlie Crist had used to fund Everglades restoration, he would cancel coal projects. He had set emissions targets for the state. And compared to the rest of the US, Florida was sort of above average for what climate action might look like. When Governor Rick Scott took over in 2011, we had a quite dramatic shift. So from 2011 to 2019, under the Scott administration, the government banned the words sustainability, climate change, and global warming from appearing in any official government policy or document. This was all found out afterwards in this investigative report, and the administration denied it heavily, but many employees sort of came forward and said, yes, we were never allowed to even mention those words. In cases where previous policy had sort of snuck it in, it was literally crossed out and changed. In particular, sea level rise was supposed to be only referred to as nuisance flooding, according to the report. So as you can imagine, in that decade, Florida really fell far back in terms of climate action. And now it's far behind the rest of the US in terms of where it's at, despite being on the forefront of these climate impacts. Now we have Governor Ron DeSantis pictured here, and leaps and bounds ahead of the Scott administration because we now do acknowledge that climate change is real, but it still falls far short of acknowledging anthropogenic climate change. It's still this threat-based mindset. And the reason that matters is because when at the state level, there's climate denial, it trickles down to the local level. Now local governments need this special contradictory effort to get anything done in terms of sustainability. And it's much easier for them, who are often already strapped for resources and time, to just ignore the issue and focus on what will get them immediately reelected or what will get them favor with their bosses almost. So that's why it really matters. This trickle down avoidance inhibits local climate action. So if we bring this back to our research question, we can sort of consider how to put all of this together. So first we asked, what is the role of acknowledging the anthropogenic roots of climate change? And we find that plans that acknowledge climate change promote mitigation and long-term sustainability interests far more than those that do not. So we do think that acknowledging climate change is an essential first step towards long-term sustainable development. We also considered what are these key discursive practices that sort of underpin acknowledgement. And we have identified two main themes. So the first is environmental leadership. As I sort of mentioned, local governments are often just strapped for time. They rely on volunteers and extra funding to make things happen. So the long-term goal of sustainability can quickly be moved aside for more immediate, short-term, urgent goals. And this is where environmental champions can really intervene. So even just one person, one group, or one strike that gets a lot of media attention seems to be enough to really change the agenda at the municipal level. And that environmental champions have a lot of power in how they influence their local leaders to act. And then the second is risk severity, and specifically flood risk severity. So a lot of studies have shown that recent extreme weather exposure is directly linked to how people perceive the climate. And it does seem like we see that same trend for local governments. So those governments that have just been decimated by flooding specifically have this adaptation focus, while those that have maybe not been bothered as much take a more objective, balanced approach. And lastly, we just wanted to consider what are the broader implications. So there have been so many psychological studies that show that hope and positive appeals are better than fear in generating action. And local governments really are no exception. Those plans are so different in tone. Neptune Beach's plan conveys this deep sense of eco-anxiety, stressful even to read it when you think about how much threat that city is just constantly under. And even though if you just move a slight bit down the coast, when you look at Cocoa or Stewart, those plans have empowered themselves, empowered their cities as these capacity and powerful action decision makers. And it just lends itself so much more credibility and optimism in terms of what it can accomplish. So we find that just the narrative of whether you acknowledge anthropogenic climate change or not is an essential element to just completely facilitate long-term thinking and mitigation actions. And that's really how we hope that local governments use these findings. So we hope that they maybe embrace environmental champions as a valuable system of checks and balances to just help them out when they're not ready or they don't have their own capacity to push forward the sustainability agenda. And we also hope that they screen themselves for recency biases and maybe look towards scientific evidence or other sources of information rather than just what flooding happened most recently here. With an election coming up in Australia, I think the natural question is also, what do we do to extrapolate this beyond Florida with the election coming up here in New South Wales? First of all, I think Florida and New South Wales are quite similar in many situations in the sense that coast is very important. There's been this political swing back and forth, but what's really unique, I think, even despite the specific coastal context, is that this acknowledgement of anthropogenic climate change is pretty much universal. Like we're saying that it's this really powerful first step, and it doesn't really matter, even if the specific context of coastal flooding or environmental champions might change, the factor of acknowledgement is really ubiquitous and could be used anywhere as a powerful first step. And it's an easy first step because it's saying that an individual person or a small town could have impact and be a driving force for making change. And lastly, as Phil mentioned, this was a winter research project, so it was a little bit limited in terms of scope. We relied only at these 5 towns and we only looked at public record documents. So an obvious next step would be to look beyond public record documents because a lot of those power dynamics probably are not visible on public record. And so using interviews or surveys and other mentions of other methods of information gathering would be good. And then these 5 towns do cover geographically the coast of Florida, but simply looking at more would help create more generalizable findings. On our end, we actually reached out to each of these 5 towns and shared our findings with them. as well as my hometown in Florida, which does not yet have a sustainability plan. We also shared with the Florida Institute of Technology, which helped develop COCO's plan, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So we actually did hear back from Stuart and from the Florida Institute of Technology. So we are hopeful that maybe these takeaways could actually be used at the local government level, and we're excited to see where it might go. So with that, these are some of our key references, and we'd love to take your questions.
Thanks for trying to talk. Really good.
Cool. Can I sit down?
Yeah. I'll just. Yeah, if anyone in the room has any questions, stick up a hand, or if anyone on Zoom has one, send it through on chat, or you can just unmute yourself and talk if you'd like. Yeah. Jeff?
Thanks, both. I mean, in Australia, I'm assuming the US, it might be wrong. The way approaches to climate change is so politically loaded. And you seem to be saying there that at the local level, they weren't necessarily, the tone of the plan weren't directly associated with political leanings. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So for those on Zoom.
Why do you think that is?
Absolutely. So for those on Zoom, the question was, in Australia, there's a lot of political leanings associated with climate action and the belief in climate change. And why do we think that we found at the local level in Florida, it was less relevant? That was a very interesting finding to me as well. And I actually used to volunteer with my local city council in Central Florida in a Republican county. I think at the local level, more than party politics, just appealing to the immediate constituency is really important. The city council members I worked with prioritized their residents so heavily. Like if one person came to them with an issue about constructing a road and they were like, oh, this is going to hurt this tree and I like this tree, they would literally go and then advocate for changing the structure of the road. Or I think appealing to their constituency really trumps almost anything else for them. And at the local level in Florida, I'm not actually sure what it's like in Australia. They're not affiliated with a party. They're only affiliated with or at least most choose not to affiliate with a party, and they run on their own private platforms. So there's a lot of unique combinations that are not bound to the sort of binary split of state and national level politics, which I think allows for a place like Florida, which is really at the forefront of climate impact, to care more because it is what the citizens are genuinely facing. I don't think you would see the same thing if you went a little inland to a different state, but that does seem to be the way that Florida handles it.
I was seeing American teal issues at play here as well, where there's the traditional conservatives are actually in this particular place are also a bit more wealthy, affluent, that might also be more concerned over climate change. Does that come into play?
Sure, yeah, I think so. I think that is very much like the teal, from what I understand, the teal party politics to be. It is very similar. They are wealthy, they are affluent, they care a lot about their ocean and their ocean views, and sort of the underlying motivations might be different, but the outcome of caring is quite similar.
Just add to Jeff's original question about the methodology. We did try to work out at the local government level what the political leanings were, but it was unreliable in the data. We couldn't actually present it. So we tried to see if we could track candidates based upon their political affiliation through some other means, but yeah, there's nothing that you could present in a journal article that was reliable. So eventually we just had to make a note that this is the county level politics, but some towns, in Cocoa was one that stood out, were quite clearly not aligned with what the county politics were.
Yeah, so it's good. Yeah.
Cool, yeah. Do I need to unmute Sophie?
Oh, you don't need to. Sure.
Cool.
Go ahead, Sophie.
Can't hear me. No, we don't have audio working anymore. Sorry.
can't hear Sophie either. That's not on your end.
Can you hear me now? No?
I can hear you now.
Oh, I have no idea. Sorry.
We can hear you now, Sophie. Can hear you.
Sorry, I have no idea why that wasn't working. Sorry. You'd think after 2.5 years of doing this, I'd have worked it out by now. But anyway, thank you for the presentation. So I think there's one of the interesting things about adaptation planning, which is at least what I know more about, is that it's all well and good to create a plan and to have, whether that's mentions climate change or not, or is in the context of extreme flooding or other climate change impacts. It's a completely different story when it comes to actually doing anything on the ground, and the kind of the scale of the changes that you're talking about versus the actions that might meet that challenge. You mentioned the question of like giving workers keep cups versus like transitioning away from fossil fuels. Like the scale of those two different things is completely is both completely different, but also like, the former, the keep cups might actually happen, whereas the transitioning away from fossil fuels almost certainly won't. And so I'm just wondering then, like, where you kind of go in terms of the next steps of like thinking about what these plans, like what actually happens to these plans when they hit the ground in terms of what it then might mean for responding to climate change in these acutely vulnerable places.
Yeah, that's a really good point and a really interesting point to think about too. I think a really cool follow-up study or similar study to this would be to, in 5 years, go back and look at what actually happened out of these plans, because you're absolutely right. This is all at the planning stage. And because this was all roughly like in the 2020 timeframe, like these plans were just now released when we were writing this paper, there's pretty much not really a lot of information as to what was being done so far. So yeah, I would actually be really curious to go back to some of these town websites and maybe see if they have any kind of status report. I will say some plans were more implementation focused than others. So as I mentioned, the Hallandale Beach one and the Stewart one really had this timeline for events. They had very specific nuanced objectives versus some that were more general with like very broad strokes. So possibly those that were more detailed and maybe used external consultants just demonstrate a level of seriousness and severity that would hopefully lead to action. But yeah, no, super curious to see what that looks like in a few years.
Let me know if you do further work about planning and consultants, because I have a lot of colleagues who write on that topic. So I'd be happy to talk to you more about that.
Cool, thank you, I will.
Have you seen any other studies in the states of, I mean, obviously not using the same methodology, but looking at similar issues?
Yeah.
And are your findings compatible or?
Thank you for that question. And to repeat the question for Zoom, he just asked, have we seen any other studies in the States that are comparable, and how do our findings sort of stack up compared to those? There are actually a lot of studies being done, but the interesting bit is that they all focus on cities. So for example, they study Boston, they study Miami, they study Austin, and there's been a lot of work on city sustainability. Part of the reason we decided to focus on towns is because, as Phil alluded to, they actually make up the vast majority of places, and not in terms of population, but in terms of size and percentage. And because of that, there's been very limited study. We actually did not find much at all that had to do with towns specifically. So at this level, this seems to be the first project that we could find, but it does match up pretty closely with what we found at the city level as well. So even for larger cities, these are some of the same threads that people have found, especially the environmental champions bit, and acknowledgement is a little bit more of a evolving and newer concept, but it is seen in some of the studies that acknowledgement is also a positive tone, and the positive approach seems to be working better and linked with more positive outcomes.
Question, it's a more personal one. When you saw that Melbourne, where you're from in Florida, didn't have a sustainability action plan, did that inspire you to want to be that environmental champion, or get in touch with them after you graduate and like see if you could push them?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Camille. Yeah, so as Camille mentioned, I am from West Melbourne, which is like a pretty small town close to Cocoa in the same county. And I was volunteering over the break while I was stuck in the States with my local city council. And sort of trying to be that person who just reminded them every now and then, like, oh, this is a thing, it would be good if we did. And I don't really know how that's going, because as I've sort of said, like, that local government is so strapped for time and for resources that I would show up to these town halls and the concepts would be received very favorably, but implementation, like Sophie was just alluding to, is just so tough to get done. And local government is also just very slow being. So even just saying, can I speak at this meeting, would be a matter of like a month later, they would give me approval to speak, and then so on and so forth. So I do hope, like, this study was sort of done after I was done with the volunteering and here during my master's, but it did give me a little bit of hope that maybe I could be the environmental champion, or maybe I could be one of the environmental champions that sort of puts it on their agenda. And I do hope so. One of the city councilmen that I work with is now very passionate about sustainability, and he emails me his questions every now and then. So I do hope that that is enough to make a difference and help Melbourne put together a sustainability plan. I think it will happen. He's very eager about it.
Any other questions from the room or from people online? Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Srimayi and Phil. That was a really great, interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought.